Hello again. I'm Elizabeth Korsmo, the curator here at Tacoma Historical Society. Thank you for joining us for our monthly program series. As you probably know, this is not our usual venue. We like to have these monthly lectures at the museum on site. However, as you also likely know, we're currently in the middle of moving our museum, and thus with the wonders of technology, we'll be bringing you virtual programs until we're able to reopen at our new location on the Brewery blocks. So, without further ado, I wanted to get into today's topic, which is textiles. As you probably know if you've met me before, textiles are my favorite area of historical material culture research. Also, I'm a bit of a textile artist myself, and I think they're really interesting not only as artifacts of the past, but as objects in need of conservation and care. And so today we're going to be talking a little bit about what we mean by textiles, what different varieties there are, and how that translates into the ways that we display them in the museum, as well as the ways that we need to take care of them and what their particular needs are. So thank you very much for joining us today, and I'd like to get started on this fascinating topic. So those of you who joined us for the Tacoma clothing exhibit the other year might remember this little hands-on activity we had during the exhibit where you could feel the different textiles and then lift them up and see what kind of objects they are. And I brought this out again, one, because it's fun, and two, just to talk about what I mean when I'm talking about different textiles. So there's sort of two main attributes that help us define what textile is, and that would be the material that it's made of, usually the fiber, and then also the weave or the construction technique, how those threads are put together to make a fabric. Because of course, fabric ultimately comes back to this stuff, which is thread. And without getting to too much of a deep dive here, the thread is then the way it's constructed is really what gives the fabric a lot of its interesting properties. Not just, the warmth and the sensation of feeling it, but also how it behaves, how it acts, how it drapes, how you use it, and how it can be divided up. So some of the fun examples here that you may remember, and I wish that we were in person so you could actually handle these pieces and feel them. But we have a variety of both natural and synthetic fibers. Natural fibers, of course, are going to be coming from plants or animals that you encounter in the world. Technically minerals if we're counting asbestos, but let's not go there. Synthetics can be derived from natural feedstocks, particularly with rayon, but for the most part, they're going to be petrochemical byproducts. So basically plastic. So within the natural fiber realm, which a lot of our older fibers, of course, a lot of the older textiles we deal with are going to be natural fibers. You have on the luxurious end silk, like this lovely window pane fabric you see here. It's a very soft and light hand because the fibers themselves are made from the cocoon of silkworm moths, which have been unwound and then spun together to make a very fine, strong thread that has a beautiful luster. And different ways that you weave it, which is to say different ways of assembling the fabric, can give it different properties. So we have, for instance, with this window pane silk, it's very soft and light. You can literally see through it because the fine threads have been spaced just so. Whereas you have a slightly denser weave, like this little bit of taffeta here. It's the same material, and it's just a matter of the weave construction. You see a difference between this sheer, see-through, very lightweight piece and a heavier one that has a little bit of body to it and that you can't see through. This one was actually chosen for the board because it also has this satin stripe here. Satin is a different weave, which we'll get into in a moment, that allows you to have multiple threads sort of floating over the top, so that you get these longer lengths of a single thread being exposed, which actually gives it a beautiful sheen. And if you can feel it, it actually is a very soft, luxurious hand. Satin is, however, a weave. It's a way of assembling those threads into a fabric. And so while people often will say satin when they made a silk satin or a polyester satin imitating a silk satin, you can also technically have satins of wools, of cottons, of linens. It's just a matter of having those floats in the weave. Also, sometimes you call it sateen because there's a bunch of different fancy accepted ways of referring to fabrics that have their own subnames that mean the same thing. Another example of silk we have here is this one is a little dauby weave. So those little sort of shiny plus signs that you see in the center of each of the checked boxes on this one. So the ground is again a taffeta, which when we'll get to weaves in a moment is just one over one thread, under one thread. And then they've got the little floats here are sort of almost doing a little satin effect on that supplemental weft. Other protein and natural fibers, of course, wool. So I've got here a nice wool flannel. Fabric of wool, of course, generally speaking, is from the outer coat of a sheep. There are other wool-bearing animals. There are also similar animals that we don't call their fur, when spun into thread, wool, because reasons. We don't need to get into the difference between hairy goats and woolly goats and sheep and so forth at the moment. But you also have, alpaca, llama, that will produce their own version of wool. Also rabbits. You can spin rabbit fur. It's great. But before we get too much of that, another fun example we have here as a protein fiber this is actually a bit of horsehair fabric. So this one, if you can sort of see that it bends in one direction really easily, and that is the direction that has a cotton warp. And the way this one's been done is that it has then single strands of horsehair woven in the ref. So one direction, up and down, as it were, it's cotton, so it bends in that direction. And then horizontally, it's horsehair. And so the threads themselves don't bend easily. And this is, today, hair cloth is mostly used in higher-end men's tailoring as an inner layer to help keep shape and sort of add some depth and some padding to different areas of the suit where you need to have structure and stability without it being stiff. But crinoline, an early name for one form of horsehair and linen fabric, is actually what gives us the name for supportive ladies' skirts or petticoats known as crinolines or hoop skirts. And they're also originally were construction of a similar material, taking advantage of the fact that you have stiffness in one direction from the animal hair and then softness and flexibility in the other from the softer thread, the linen or the cotton. So that's a fun one because you can literally sort of feel along this edge here where it's the hard edges of the hair sticking out. Feel sort of like you're petting a hairbrush. And then the other direction, you can actually see it folding and moving, but then if you try to go the other way, you're going to get resistance. And so that's one way that you can actually be mixing and matching threads and fibers to achieve particular effects. Moving over from the protein fibers, which is our animal-based natural fibers, to the cellulose or plant-based ones. We don't really need to get into chemical structures here, but just know that there are two, and this will have ramifications for how we care for the objects because it affects how they interact with other materials. We're all probably very familiar with cotton. So there's a nice cotton tabby weave or calico that has been printed. You can also, this piece over here, if you can see, there's a little bit of a difference in the sheen between the two. Same fiber, both cottons. This one, however, is that satin weave. Cotton, for historic reasons, is usually called sateen rather than satin when it's made with that weave. But like this little silk satin there, you can see it has a bit more sheen. So these are two cottons, satin and plain. These are two wool silks, satin and plain. And you can sort of see how the light changes based on that. We also have, in the realm of natural fibers, we have linen. So this down here is a rather coarse linen. It's a tabby weave, just like that cotton there, but it's just coarser threads, which is another thing I haven't really gotten into, but you can have, for a given fiber, for a given weave pattern even, different thicknesses and thinness of threads. You can have them set tighter, closer together, and further apart, and that can also affect the final weight of the material. Here's a cotton tarlatan that you can easily see through because there's gaps in the thread. It also has a stiffness because it's been treated with different materials as part of the finishing process. You can also have softer linens. So this green example up here, you can see is much more flexible and honestly feels much smoother than the coarser linen toweling down there. Again, same bast fibers from the same flax plant that have been spun, just these ones have been spun into smaller threads. These ones have been left coarser and thicker, and it changes the whole texture and feel of the fabric as well as its drape. You can see with this linen, it's draping nicely. This one has a bit more stiff body to it. Moving into synthetic realms, we've got a few examples here. There's a polyester, so that's going to be, rather than natural fibers, which tend to be spun, or in the case of silk, reeled together. So you have individual fiber lengths that you just twist to make a longer thread. You actually use chemical reactions to extrude the fibers for most of your synthetics. Technically, rayon's its own case where they use natural fiber feedstocks, but then chemically break them down and extrude them the same way you would a petrochemical-based thread. But they have some number of benefits. They are generally easier to produce on an industrial scale, cheaper to produce on an industrial scale, and you can use them in various ways to imitate fabrics that would be traditionally very expensive to produce, such as the silk. You can also get them to do all sorts of interesting things with waterproofing that you don't really see in your natural fibers unless you start applying waxes and gums of various sorts. So we've got here an example of rayon. So same chemical structure, if you will, as most of the cottons and linens going on here, but the fabric itself is silkier. It's smoother, it drapes a bit more, and so it's able to behave a little bit more like some of your lightweight silks, but at a much lower price point. And then one sort of last thing to get to structure-wise is the difference between knits and wovens, which I think we'll actually do better in the next section. Just want to note here that here we've got cotton poly blend knit. Here we've got an all cotton, and you can see that has a lot more stretch to it when I'm pulling on it than if I do the same thing with a woven cotton. And it's just a matter of how the threads that make up the fabric are themselves interacting. So without further ado, let's talk about that for more detail. Okay, so to elaborate a little bit on what I was saying about sort of thread, where it comes from and how we turn it into fabric and how that affects what we produce. This is an example of some wool roving. So this is what happens if you give a sheep a haircut, clean the wool nicely sort of brush it and comb it into a fluffy, approximate same direction. But this still obviously is a bit of a far cry from any of these things. So the in-between process there is known as spinning. This is a sort of reproduction medieval style bottom whorl spindle. I actually prefer a top whorl, but this is the first one I could find this morning. And the whorl, of course, is this little round disc that you see right here. And it just adds a little bit of weight to your spindle. And the stick of the spindle here is what allows us to keep track of our thread. So the way that you take this, nice chunk of sheep wool and turn it into a usable fiber is that you need to twist it together. Because obviously if we just have this hunk of wool and we pull it apart, that's not something we're going to want to be wearing. It's not going to last very long. But if we give it a few twists, it sticks a little better. A few more. It actually has some strength to it. This is still not generally something we want to be wearing. So what we're going to do is you actually want to tease out these very thin sections and then twist them. And that is what is going to start giving you something that looks a little bit more like a usable thread that you could weave, you could knit, you could sew with. And so the spindle is just a tool for doing that in bulk, that you can give it a little bit of a flick, start it spinning, and then slowly walk that into the fibers. And there's lots of different spinning techniques. There's traditions of spinning all over the world. But the spindle is just a tool for really helping hold on to that twist you've put into the fibers, and so you can turn them into a longer working thread. Because otherwise, if you look at these individual hairs, hair's technical term of art, but the individual fibers that make up the wool, you can see that the longest ones, we're talking maybe 3 inches, which isn't a whole lot when you're trying to clothe a human. So the important thing to remember with spindles is that they are a tool for managing twisted thread, and that the twist is just make all the fibers stick together. Now, once you have that, thread, the next step is to actually turn it into a usable fabric. And most of the fabrics that we use for clothing humans are woven, as I alluded to earlier. And what that means is they're set at cross angles. So in this case, this is a little, again, medieval style box loom on a bit of theme today. And the whole thing with a loom is that it's just a framework, because the threads themselves are really bendy. If we were trying to hold them at right angles and get them to lock around each other, which is all you're doing with weaving, you're just putting the threads in between each other so that they stay together and work together. But you can't do that the way you could weave a basket, because the thread itself doesn't have any rigidity. It's not going to stay put. So what we do with weaving usually, and there are definitely exceptions, is that you put them on a loom, and so you just have half of the threads held taut by the loom, and that allows the person who's doing the weaving to then use the other half of the threads to lock them in place. So by way of example, with this loom, and it's a little bit of a tricky one, this is a tablet or card weaving it's set up for. You can also have various forms of what we call heddles. Those are things that are going to allow you to individually raise and lower the threads so you can get different patterns in. But the important thing is you need half your threads going one way, half going 90 degrees to that, and you need to be changing them. What I mean by that is, I'm not sure if you can sort of see from this angle here, by taking this thinner warp thread in this case and taking it through all of my warps, when I then change the shed, just change which warp threads are going up and which ones are going down, I can't easily pull this thread back out. They're not locked in place. And similarly, it's now locked into place. And you can see the section that's been woven is actually starting to behave now like a fabric. These threads can't be easily separated because they're being held together by the crosswise thread. And so all I'm doing with this seemingly complicated apparatus is just changing which threads are up, which are down, known as your shed. And there's lots of different ways you can do that. You can do this with pickup weaving, where you're literally taking your shuttle or some extra sticks and you're choosing with that which threads are up and down. It's just a matter of you need to have some of them going one way, some another, and you need to be able to change that so that it all doesn't just fall apart the second you try moving something. This is a very ancient craft that humans have been practicing all over the world. There's many different traditions of how you go around setting up these looms and how you go about weaving, but the basic idea is all the same. It's just you're locking threads two different directions, and that's producing a fabric, a textile. That isn't, of course, the only way to turn thread or yarn into textile. Have here a rather narrow little bit of knitting, which same idea, knitting, crocheting, nail binding, macrame. There's lots of different ways without using a loom that you can make fabrics. In this case, most people are familiar with knitting, how you have your loops that I apparently abandoned in the middle of a row. And instead of a loom, we have these little sticks that just hold our loops in place and allow us to put yarn through each other. So make a new loop of yarn in the old one. And that is how the fabric is made. Just loop upon loop going through each other. And again, allows us to add some breadth and width to what is otherwise a single thread. Structurally, this is important because this fabric is a lot stretchier, depending on the technique you're doing, than your woven ones. It requires different infrastructure. It makes often a thicker material than what you get on your loom, though there's different techniques there as well. But with knits, you're going to end up with different structural integrity, different behavior. You'll see these used in different ways. Places where you need the loft and the thickness for warmth, places where you need the stretchiness in order to fit around a human body without having extensive tailoring. And since they're generally coming from the same, well, they are always coming from the same thread-based fibers as your woven materials, chemically, they're going to be very similar woven materials and knit materials, or crochet materials, or whatever textile working technique you choose. But in terms of physical properties, we then have different concerns about how they need to be supported, how they can move, how they behave. And honestly, I think it's really cool that we can start from the same basic elements, plants, animals, minerals, petrochemicals, and come up with such different fibers and different fabrics that result from them. And so when it comes to storing textiles, like most of our artifacts here in the museum, we keep them in acid-free archival boxes, like this beautiful metal edge example, probably from Hollinger. Textiles will often put in these shorter flat boxes so that we don't have to stack too many of them on top of each other, and because We ideally want to have them as flat as possible. So you can see here with this World War I Red Cross scarf that it's still folded at first in half and then over on the side here. But it's otherwise laying about as flat as we possibly can. Also know if I turn back the corner here, you can see where we have our museum label sewn in. These are important because just like with any other artifacts, we need to be able to identify which material is which. The fact that it's in the collection, we need a way of connecting it to what we call its provenance, which is the artifact's history, who donated it, and everything we know about how it was used and how it was originally made. And so by sewing a label into textile, we have a way of reversing that labeling. So we don't want to just take a pen and write directly on the artifact because that's damaging it and changing it. But a little stitched in label, you can easily snip the threads holding it in. And if you are careful and you don't actually break any of the threads in the fabric itself while sewing, that becomes a reversible way of labeling it. So this one is cotton example, and I made a brief reference earlier to different chemistry of fibers. So if you think about other things that are made of cellulose besides cotton and linen fabric and some rayons, you think of things like paper, wood, and the chemical structure of the actual molecules making up these fibers are prone to, basically they tend to come apart when exposed to acid. So that's why you can safely, to a certain extent, bleach cotton or linen to make it whiter by using bases, but you don't want to be doing the same thing with protein fibers, which will react with those bases. So with some materials like newsprint that tends to actually produce its own acid, a term that we call inherent vice in the museum world, where the thing that's making the artifact break down is part of how the artifact's made, then you might use what we call a buffered paper or material in order to neutralize some of that acid so that the artifact doesn't break down as quickly. So if you have linen or cotton fabrics, those can benefit from having that buffered material that will just help shield them from acid damage. However, those same slightly base salts able to react with acid buffered materials would actually be very bad for a protein fiber, such as this little woolen infant's coat from about the 1880s. So in this case, these two items actually share a box, and so we have an inert paper that has no acids or bases worked into it at all. It is an acid-free archival paper that's going to go between them. And so when they go in their nice storage box here, it's a layer of paper, artifact itself. Generally, if possible, we will try to pad out any creases like this so that the fabric is going over a much rounder curve rather than a sharp one, and that can help avoid damages to the individual threads. Also, we'll generally, if we do have to fold a flat fabric, the next time it comes out of its box and gets put away, we'll fold it somewhere different to sort of spread out any possibility. I'm not sure if you've seen like curtains or something else that has a bunch of set folds in it. Sometimes also with, for instance, garments people are wearing, if you have a turnaround of hem cuff and there's fabric is permanently in a curved position, and especially if it's facing any abrasion on that outside edge, you'll start seeing wear and breakage right where that curve is. And that's something that we want to try and avoid, even in a delicate situation of just being in a box. On the subject of inherent vice, another fun fact about wools that you're probably aware of is that there's lots of insects that find wool really tasty as a treat. So this little jacket was treated for insect damage when it arrived. We froze it to make sure that any lingering bugs that might be in with it were long dead, as they were, and then vacuumed it very gently in order to remove any frass, any dead bugs, any eggs, or anything that might possibly cause further damage to this artifact and to the other artifacts with it. But you can see if you look at it closely here, these little circular holes throughout that are saying at some point in the almost 150 years that this little jacket's been in existence, some moths have had a little bit of a snack on it at some point. But we'd like to avoid that going forward. So here's another fun example from the collection of a late 19th century textile. Instead of a practical little wool baby's jacket, we have a lovely bit of beaded net from a member of the Weathered family. This case, the tricky part about this net fragment, which you can see is heavily studded with little beads at each intersection and then has these larger faceted beads as well, is that it's really drapey. It doesn't have a lot of body, which is to say it doesn't have a lot of inherent stiffness. It tends to be sort of fluid, the way you think like cats can just sort of like turn themselves into mush when they don't want to move. That's what this textile does. So to fully support it, it actually has not only this board that I'm using to hold it, but the acid-free paper that it's sitting on, it's actually tied to, if you look at these little white threads here, I literally took a needle and thread, went down through a hole in the net, so it's not going through the net itself, back up through the paper to another one, and then tied a little bow so that it's sort of pinned into position throughout. And this keeps it from sort of sliding all into one corner and getting all scrunched up. And it makes it just easier to handle and carry as well as to see and display. So it's a way of taking a particular fabric with very particular traits. In this case, the looseness of the netting and the heaviness of the beads really makes it move a lot. It's very fluid. And then trying to solve that as a way of keeping it safe and stable for long-term storage so that it doesn't get damaged, doesn't get knotted in itself. And we want this to be able to last for decades more so that people can see it and understand how it was made and, more clearly imagine what going to a dinner party in Tacoma in the 1890s would have looked like when people are wearing fabric that behaves like this. Hats are another fun garment type which fits under the textile umbrella while providing some more interesting challenges than simply laying them flat between paper, since obviously human heads tend to be rounded and hats that are meant to fit that are going to be similarly shaped in interesting ways. So I've got here a few of the different solutions that we use depending on how fragile the hat is, how much space we have for it, and what other particular needs it has. So if you're very lucky as a hat, you get a nice professionally made mount. You can see that this one, it's a solid ethafoam block that's been shaped, padded, and covered with an inert fabric base. And so the hat will just very gently sit over that, and that way it's supported on all sides. Because if you took a hat like this and just sort of set it down on its brim, if you will, doesn't really have one, you're going to risk the rounded hat shape sort of getting crushed over time, possibly developing creases, possibly getting damaged, and then not being in its original shape when you're going to display it. And so that's what a mount like this provides, is just that little bit of structure so that the hat is being supported in the shape that it was merely meant to occupy. So we also have the homemade version of that, modeled by this lovely Tacoma-made hat. And it's ethafoam, which is an inert closed cell alternative to styrofoam that can be cut and shaped. And so that provides the solid base at the bottom. It's been covered in a layer of batting that provides the softness and the roundness so we don't have any sharp corners, and so that we can really copy the shape of the hat itself. And then that's just a plain cotton muslin, nice inert fabric that's been stretched over the top. Idea being that our hat here again sits very gently there. It's not having all of its weight pushed onto a rounded brim that's not meant to be bearing the weight of the hat. The hat is meant to be sitting on a human head with the areas of contact on the underside there. And then in this case, it also helps keep some of the trailing feathers and netting from getting caught up underneath the hat itself. The far end, especially with some of our more modern baseball caps, for instance, just a bit of crushed acid-free tissue paper inside the hat can help give it a little bit more support and hold it in its appropriate shape so that it doesn't get crushed in storage. So we want all of these beauties to be available for generations to come. So moving on to some larger garments, you're probably figured out by now humans aren't generally flat. So we often, if we want to have flat piece of fabric fit us in a comfortable way that allows movement, you need to do some shaping and tailoring. So it generally results in garments that we're trying to preserve in the museum having their own shapes and their own quirks and support needs. So you'll see here with this lovely, it's white, black, and pink plaid, very lightweight cotton fabric made into an early 20th century dress. It has some beautiful lace insertion in the front and on the sleeves. So it's a beautiful, relatively delicate item. And it's also just a tiny bit too long for this box. So on the one sleeve here that we're going to need to fold back to allow the rest of the bodice to lie flat, we're going to be using these little rolls of acid-free paper. And it's simply a matter of gently setting it into the part of the upper sleeve here where we're going to need to have it folded back in order to fit into the box. So you can see we've got bodice mostly lying flat, except for that one sleeve. And next time this goes into the box, that for some reason we need to take it out for a study visit or to have it on display, it will be put back in with the other sleeve folded and the one that has been folded lying out flat. Because of how you can sort of see during its over a century of life already, this fabric has gotten a little bit crushed together. So it's a little crunched, a bit wrinkled, you might say. If this was something you were wearing today, you'd probably give it a nice steam and then iron it as best you could. But we don't do that. We don't want to possibly damage fragile fibers in the fabric. So instead what I've done is I actually made another little roll of paper, just a bit longer than the one that's under the elbow fold, and it's very gently been inserted into the other sleeve here in order to give it a little bit more support. That's something that it ends up taking a bit more room. We can't do it with every single garment, but with our more fragile pieces, let's say we have a silk material that's starting to split, giving it that extra bit of support will just make fewer points where it's possibly creasing and breaking. For those of you who caught our previous video that we did about agents of deterioration, you probably noticed that I'm not wearing gloves right now. And that's because one of the things that can damage textiles is having a bit too much rough handling. And so by washing your hands, you can get the oils and the microscopic dust that might otherwise be transferred onto the fabric off of them, but then also not have any reduction in sensitivity, which is really important when you want to avoid accidentally tearing or, abrading fabric. So I bet you're asking yourself, what about really big textiles? And there's a couple different options there. One of the most common is actually to store them rolled up. So if you imagine the wider version of like a wrapping paper roll that's either made out of inert cardboard or else has been covered with a barrier material, and then the quilt itself is wrapped around that in layers with acid-free paper and then tied off on the outside with a protective barrier, usually of Tyvek. In our case, we don't have that many large oversized quilts, and so we don't have a dedicated area to hang up all of these rolls. Because you can imagine once you've rolled your fabric up nicely, you then don't want to just set it down so that all of that weight is concentrated on a single point. So usual method there is to actually run a supporting rod through the center of that hollow roll. And so the fabric's being supported from underneath. In our case, what we end up doing instead is getting some of our largest boxes and then very gently folding our quilt, again, padding in the round as much as possible, which is what we're going to do when this guy goes into a box in a moment. Some of you may recognize this lovely quilt from Tithlow Lodge, which hung up there for many years before Parks Tacoma kindly donated it to our museum. So to recap, today we talked a little bit about garments, about the fabrics they're made from, and how those are in turn made from a wide variety of plant, animal, and synthetic materials that have been spun or otherwise turned into thread, woven, knit, or otherwise turned into fabric, and then made into garments, and a little bit about how those affect the traits that the fabric has and what we need to do to take care of them. A lot of these principles, which you'll also remember from our video about preserving artifacts in the museum, are things that can be applied in your own home. So if you have family textiles, family garments that you'd like to preserve, many people have a wedding dress or a christening dress running around, choose appropriate materials to pack it away in. Support the garment as much as you can and try and avoid crushing it or sharp creases and folds. Getting it out of direct light and into some sort of protective enclosure and keeping it at as cool and dry of a temperature as you can manage are all things that help it last a bit longer and are many of the same principles that we're using within the museum to preserve these articles of Tacoma dress for future generations of researchers and viewers like you. So thank you very much for joining us today. We'll have another program, of course, coming out next month, and we look forward to being able to see you all again in person when we reopen in our new museum space later this year. Thank you so much for joining us.